what I want to do now, so we presented just the general trends in terms of trade flows, economic importance of services for different economies. And so now we're going to start to look a little bit at how services are addressed in trade agreements. Okay, so I want in this, I think Richard will go after that into the Peso Plus services chapter. I want to go through some of the key features of the GATS, which is the Multilateral Agreement on Services, and to highlight some of the key concepts. The key concept and some of the key obligations. Does that work? Yeah. I can just talk loudly, I think.
It's up to you.
Yeah, I'll do that. If you don't hear me, just raise your hand. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the key concepts in the GATS. So essentially the modes of supply, which are very relevant for Peso Plus, and also some of the key obligations, but then I will leave aside the schedules of commitments because we'll have a more focused discussion of that later on. Okay, mostly tomorrow, I think. But there's still a number of other important things to cover. So what is the purpose of the GATS? And a lot of that, these are just my own kind of ideas, but it's a lot similar for any type of international agreement on trade and services. The GATS has particular value because it defined new trade concepts. It defined what is trade and services. So negotiators, when they develop this multilateral agreement, they define what is trade and services. This is what we will see in a second. And this was then used in different ways in regional trade agreements. It provides a legal framework for cooperation, international exchanges on trade and services. It provides some guidance for services, trade policies of governments, so some rules to follow and so on. So some guidance, what to avoid, what is better. Of course, it assists governments that want to reduce their barriers to trade. This is important because services agreements, whether in the WTO or in regional trade agreements, it's not like trade in goods. Okay, trade in goods, the general objective is to bring down the tariff to zero over time for substantially all trade, essentially. Okay, for services, there's some of that, but typically governments don't do reforms, although there are exceptions, but typically governments will not open up their services sector as a direct result of negotiations. Sometimes it will happen in some areas, but it's not like for goods because it's a bit more complicated to reform services policies. If you're going to open up the telecom sector, it takes time. You need to introduce new legislation, new regulations. So it's a bit more difficult. It's less common than for trade in goods. But trade agreements are important because they can encourage that, and they can also consolidate the reforms that governments have put in place. So a lot of governments have used trade agreements to bind, to consolidate reforms they had made. So for example, governments have opened up their telecom sector, they gotten rid of the monopoly, and many of them wanted to bind that, to guarantee that, to consolidate these reforms or plans for reforms in trade agreements. Because that way, there's no going back. So governments made a big effort, it lasts a lot of time to open up a sector, then they want to guarantee that it's not going to be reversed. And trade agreements help do that. Trade agreements help to coordinate economic policy making for services at the in terms of the international dimension of regulation. One of the key challenges of services is that there are many government departments responsible for services. Tourism, central bank, transport ministry, finance ministry, telecom ministry, and so on. Education, health. Many different ministries coordinate, regulate services, and so trade agreements, trade negotiations should help coordinate, and all these different government departments think about what is their international policy with respect to services. So if I ask you, what are your key objectives in terms of your trade policy? You may have some ideas. But if I ask you, what are your key objectives in terms of your services trade policies? Or your approach, your national approach to services, to the service sector, or to trade and services? More difficult, right? Even though it's most of your economy. You may have a plan for tourism, but what is the coordinated approach? It's not always clear. But services, negotiations, agreements kind of force you to think a little bit about that. Of course, the agreements help to guarantee better access to foreign markets for your suppliers. So you know that you will have access to the Australian market, the New Zealand market, and other markets. So that's important for governments to plan and for suppliers to invest and trade. A key value of these agreements is to provide for more transparency of trade, of key trade measures, and more predictability. So even if trade agreements in services typically do not lower existing barriers directly as a result, like for goods, there's still a lot of value in all different types of regional agreements on services in terms of predictability, because they guarantee that existing levels of openness will remain, that new barriers will not be introduced, and that's important to attract investment, to export, and to import services. And of course, these agreements allow for some form of resolution of disputes. Okay, no need, I won't go into the details of the GATS. I just want to focus on some of the same features, because then a lot of it is similar in Peso Plus, and then when there are differences, we can focus on the differences. Typically, well, in the GATS, the scope of the agreement, so what the agreement applies to, is very broad. And it's like that in all trade agreements on services, a very broad scope. That does not necessarily mean a lot. In the end, what matters are the specific obligations, the specific disciplines in the agreement. But the scope is very broad. It applies to all measures of governments affecting trade and services. Okay? All measures of government at any level of government, central government, municipal government, regional governments, at all government levels, affecting, so affecting is also broadly defined, trade and services. It applies in principle to all services, with only two exceptions, which you also have in Peso Plus, what we call governmental services, which I'll come back to in a second, and measures affecting air traffic rights. So in the GATS and in regional trade agreements, most of the air transport sector is excluded. So nothing in the agreement applies to the core of the sector, so the transport of passengers or transport of freight by air. Okay? Because there's a lot of bilateral agreements and it would just have been a bit too complicated. Okay? some air transport services that are covered, like maintenance and repair. In Peso Plus, I think you have airport services. So there's a few other, auxiliary services related to air transport, but not the core transport of, passenger traffic or freight traffic by air. Okay, measures affecting trade and services, all services at all government levels. What is trade and services? Very important. So that's what we'll discuss. Trade and services in the GATS is defined by 4 modes of supply. Okay, and this is what we'll go through in some detail. Cross-border supply, so we touched on that a little bit in the earlier presentation. Cross-border supply, mode 1. Mode 2, consumption abroad. Mode 3, commercial presence. And mode 4, presence of natural persons. And the GATS, like other trade agreements on services, applies, and this is a bit different than for goods, applies to both the product, so the service, but also to the service suppliers. So you will see some of the obligations relate to the service suppliers. So it's non-discrimination, not only with respect to the service being supplied, but also to the supplier of the service. Okay, before going to the modes of supply, what is included? So I mentioned air transport or some air transport services. The other thing that is excluded from the scope, so if it's excluded from the scope, it means there's nothing in the agreement that applies to governmental services. Okay, none of the obligations, nothing in the agreement applies to what we call services supplied under governmental authority. Okay, and this is defined in the agreement as services that are supplied neither in competition nor under commercial terms. So can you think of a service in your country that is supplied neither in competition nor under commercial terms? Typically, there's not a lot of that, but and it depends on the country. In some countries, you will have some services supplied with no competition, not on commercial terms, and in another country, it will be a different situation. So can you think of a service where only the government provides, and it does not provide it in commercial terms? There's no bad answers, So, huh?
Roads, bridges, parks.
Yeah, it's not really a service. They buy the service to construct the bridge and so on, but it's not really a service they provide. They hire people to build it, that's a bit different. That would be government procurement. Yeah, that would be government procurement, which it's a good point actually, because government procurement is very important in services. So all the construction of roads, construction of bridges, the government buys a service from people for its own use, okay? And that is not entirely excluded from the scope, but the key obligations of the agreement, national treatment, market access, most favored nation treatment, do not apply to government procurement. I think it's the same thing in Peso Plus, so it means it's not something you need to mention in your schedule. So governments often will discriminate when they buy services, like construction services to build roads. They may only give the contract to local companies. But that's allowed because it's government procurement. Okay? But it's a different thing. So here we're talking about services supplied under governmental authority. So what might it be? A service that the government supplies. Very good. Police, fire service, taxation services. So nobody else provides police services. It's not provided on commercial terms. You don't have to pay, to receive the police service. So in most countries that would fit well, probably all countries that would fit the definition of what is a service provided under governmental authority that is excluded from the scope entirely of the GATS. Okay, so nothing in the agreement applies to that. Okay? Is that clear? Okay, now the different modes of supply. So that's very important that we understand that. It's a bit different than of course, for trade in goods. So there are 4 modes of supply. So trade and services is defined according to these 4 modes of supply. And you know, these modes of supply were established by governments when they created the multilateral agreement on services. And then regional agreements essentially used the same concepts, okay? And there are 4 modes of supply because services, by their very nature, often you need to have proximity between the supplier and the consumer of the service, right? I mean, especially at a time when there was not a lot of opportunities for digital supply, you needed the supplier and the consumer to be at the same place at the same time. So for example, haircut services. You need the supplier of the haircut to be where the consumer of the haircut is. Okay? So this need for proximity, for simultaneity in production and consumption have led to the different modes of supply, as we'll see in a second. So cross-border trade is defined in the GATS as supply of a service from the territory of one member to territory of the other member. So it's a bit like trade in goods. So what crosses the border is the service. Okay? So here you have an illustration with a wall which symbolizes the border. You have the service supplier in one country, the consumer in the other country, and what crosses the border is the service. That's captured by balance of payment statistics. So give me some examples of trade under mode 1. Service supplier in one country, consumer in the other, and it's the service that crosses the border. Yeah, tell me. You want to test it before you test with the neighbor, then if he says yes, then you say it to everybody.
Like a commercial airline?
Yeah, well, transport, yeah, well, airline is excluded, so, but yeah, essentially transport, maritime transport, road transport, so the service of transporting something or somebody from one country to another, that's mode 1.
The seasonal work program? The seasonal work program?
No. Here the supplier is in one country, the consumer is in the other. That's something else. We'll come to some of that later. Yeah.
Thanks, how about the law firm?
The what?
A law firm advising
Yes.
telephone to
Yes, very good.
line on the other side.
Yes. So yeah, professional services, legal services, accounting, engineering, or whatever consulting services with the supplier in one country, advising somebody else in another country by phone, by internet, by Zoom, by whatever. Okay? So now, of course, with all these tools, digital tools we have, it's a lot easier to do that. You know, with Teams and Zoom, and to provide services from one territory of one into the territory of the other. So it's the legal advice or the professional advice that crosses the border. The service is sent by telephone, delivered by telephone, by email, by Zoom, or whatever other communication means. Anything else?
How about the streaming services?
Sorry?
The streaming services.
Yes. So all types of audiovisual services, telecom services provided cross-border.
Banks?
Financial services, a lot of that is provided by banks that are not established in the territory to consumers in the territory. So banks abroad provide a service into Samoa. Okay? It could be, now with digital technologies, it can be almost anything. Education services, so you can take courses online, have the service cross the border, some health advice, health services provided cross-border by somebody that is abroad. Okay? So that particular mode of supply is growing in importance because now it's becoming easier to provide these services. It is important for a lot of developed countries. It's the most important mode of supply in terms of their exports. Or at least it is a mode of supply that is increasing in importance because of the digital trade opportunities. Okay, that clear? Mode 2 is what we call consumption abroad. So the second mode of supply. So now in the other modes of supply, we see that it reflects a need for proximity between the supplier of the service and the consumer. Okay? They're not in different countries. With the other modes of supply, the supplier and the consumer are in the same country. So in this case, supply of a service in the territory of one party to the service consumer of any other party. So what this means is that essentially the consumer of the service goes abroad to consume services in the territory of the supplier of the service. So can you give me, say, 3 examples of that? Tourism is the most obvious example. So this is, most of mode 2 relates to tourism in terms of numbers. So the foreign consumer, the foreign tourist, you know, like me, I come here, I consume hotel services, restaurant services. Okay? A foreign tourist comes to consume locally. So it's a transaction between resident, non-resident, and it's also captured by balance of payments. So mode 2, consumption abroad. Other examples aside from tourism? Education. So foreign students come here to consume education services. Very good. Something else? Health. Yeah, very good. Health services. So foreign patients come to consume different types of health services. That's also mode 2. So it can be any type of service that a foreign consumer comes in to consume in the country. But typically more significant for tourism, and then for some countries for education, for health. Yeah.
How does motor vessels transporting and repair on another country is that?
It's like you've seen the slide. So mode 2 essentially also clarifies, and again, same concepts in Pacer Plus. This also covers situations where the consumer's property goes abroad to receive a service. So the obvious example there is ship repair. So if you send your ship or your car, well, car is more difficult here, but if you send your ship to be repaired abroad, that's mode 2. Okay? So if I'm in Switzerland, like I do, sometimes I take my car. I take my car to France to get it repaired because it's much cheaper across the border. That's also mode 2. Okay? So again, just to illustrate, we have the border here, supplier, and in this case, it's the consumer that goes abroad, and so the service is consumed, is supplied in the country of the supplier. So you're exporting services even though the service is supplied within your territory. So in tourism, you're supplying hotel services, restaurant services to foreigners, to foreign tourists, and that's an export of services for Samoa or others, okay? Even though the service is not supplied abroad. The third mode of supply, and as we saw in a previous presentation, in economic terms, it's the most important. So about 60% of world trade globally takes place under mode 3. So mode 3 is supply of a service of one member through commercial presence in the territory of the other member. So in this case, it's the supplier of the service that kind of goes into the country of the consumer. So there's a need for proximity. So it establishes a commercial presence, so a business establishment abroad to supply the service through that commercial presence. Okay, so what, yep.
Thank you, Martin. Just to clarify, on modes 1 and 2, you mentioned they are the ones that are normally captured, the statistics and the data. Can you just clarify how examples that we've seen, how it is captured in national statistics, like you talk about Zoom, telephone call, or service.
Yeah.
How is that captured? Are they all captured, or some of them are not?
For modes 1, 2, and well, especially modes 1 and 2, they would all be captured. The idea with national statistics, balance of payments, would capture these two modes of supply. But in balance of payment statistics, there's no distinction between modes 1 and 2. So these statistics don't say there's so much under mode 1, so much under mode 2. They cover transactions between residents and non-residents. Okay, and then they will classify them in different sectors. Okay, so they will classify, you have a category that is travel. So of course, most of that you can deduce is linked to tourism, and most of that would essentially be mode 2. But your balance of payment statistics will not distinguish between the modes. They will just tell you transactions, resident, non-resident, and then different, sectors and sub-sectors. But it would cover all these transactions between residents, non-residents, whether by Zoom or any other technological means.
Wouldn't the data be only be captured if you declare it in some financial statement in balance of payments would pick that up? If it's provided for free, say for example under warranty, would that be picked up as well? I'm just wondering how balance of payments would pick up things that don't.
I mean, these are really statistical issues that I'm not a statistician, so people working on statistics would be doing this types of data collection. I think most of the balance of payment statistics would be done through surveys. They would do surveys of companies to assess, because it doesn't go through customs, so they can't collect it in the same way as they might for goods. So I'm not an expert in statistics, but I think this is how they would do it. And then you have, the IMF and others have produced manuals for collection of data on balance of payments in terms of how to classify by different sectors, what to collect, what not to collect. And this is not something trade officials would do. We're just users of the statistics, essentially. But I think for services, most of it is collected through surveys.
Which is then dependent on the honesty and the memory of someone.
There's nothing perfect, but yeah. But there are different ways, to estimate and fill in the gaps and, different methods to do that. Now, so this is commercial presence. Can anybody give me any examples? In your country, in what sector is that particularly important? So a country establishes a commercial presence to provide services within your country. Yeah.
We have Kiwi Bank in Kiwi Bank.
Yeah. So financial services, most of it would be provided through an entity established in the country. Sometimes providing cross-border, it's a bit more difficult to regulate it. So sometimes countries will require an establishment to provide the services. So banking services, yes, or insurance can be provided through that. Almost every sector can be provided through a commercial presence. But in your countries, where is it more important? Telecommunications, very good. So you can have foreign owned or foreign controlled business establishment in your country that provide telecom services. Yes, maybe the two most important sectors. Which other sectors are particularly important in terms of size and number of people employed?
Hotels.
Tourism, so hotels, a lot of foreign establishment in the country providing hotel services. Yeah, we've hit 3 of the most important sectors, maybe another 1 or 2. What else?
Where does TTCR and Vodafone fit in? Are they part of Vodafone and TTCR?
Sorry?
Vodafone and TTCR, are they part of, I'm just asking.
Yeah, but what type of?
Mobile?
Yeah, telecom. That would be telecom, yeah. Construction, yeah. You can have foreign construction companies that establish the country to provide services. What else? A sector that will employ a lot of people domestically and where you can have some foreign suppliers. What would it be? That employs in almost every country a good share of the workforce. That's a service sector. Maybe you've already consumed that service this morning if you got out of the hotel. Huh? Well, transport, it could, yeah, of course you can have commercial presence and transport too. Distribution services. So retail, wholesale, supermarkets, the stores. That employs a lot of people, can attract some foreign investment, especially the bigger stores. Okay, so commercial presence, of course, has important links to foreign investment, right? Because to provide a service through a commercial presence means you establish a business establishment, you establish a foreign-owned company, so you invest abroad. Okay, so in that way, the service agreement at the multilateral level in the WTO, Mode 3 is very important and it has very strong links to investment. And in PESA Plus also, because your schedules of commitment will include commitments in Mode 3 for services, so in some way covering investment in the service sector. Okay? So again, using the wall, service supplier in one country, it goes to the territory of the consumer by establishing a business establishment or any type of professional establishment that it owns or controls and provides a service to a consumer. Okay, the most important mode of supply. So that's why I was saying at the beginning, trade in services, it's about exporting, yes, but it's also about attracting investment. Most countries would be more interested in attracting investment, importing under Mode 3 than sending investment abroad, which is also important, but mostly people want to attract investment. They want to grow their sector, they want more people to be employed, more taxes to be paid, and so that's why it's particularly relevant here. And the last mode of supply, mode 4, and again, it's the supplier that goes to the country of the consumer. In this case, it's not a professional or business establishment, it's not a legal person or a branch, it's a natural person. Okay, so a physical person goes abroad temporarily to provide a service. Okay, so it's a service supplier that goes abroad temporarily to provide a service. Okay, so it's not somebody that goes to work in a local company abroad. It's a foreign service supplier that temporarily goes abroad to provide a service. So for example, a lawyer working independently or working for law firms in, I don't know, New Zealand, comes in Samoa to provide a service in person to a consumer, and then he flies back. Okay? Or it can also be somebody that is transferred from the parent company to the investment abroad. So the example of the Kiwi Bank in Niue, so the New Zealand bank may transfer to the subsidiary Niue a manager, for example, from the parent to the subsidiary. So that is also covered by Mode 4.
In that case, wouldn't there be double counting with mode 3? Because that person that sells, the company that sells something.
Well, I mean, all the modes are linked, you know, but they don't really cover the same thing. But it's true that in the real world, you know, this is a construct that was made by the trade negotiators, and the purpose was to have a broad definition of what was trade and services, and then to cover, you know, to have distinctions between the different modes to allow countries to take different types of commitments on different modes of supply. But in the reality, you know, one company will often do business through the 4 modes of supply. It will invest abroad, will send some people abroad to work within the subsidiary. It will also supply cross-border services, and so it will all do these different forms of trade at the same time. But they measure different things, and more importantly, the measures of governments will affect different modes of supply. So you may allow the company to establish, the foreign company to establish a new way, you may allow that, but maybe you don't allow the transfer of all types of personnel from the parent to the subsidiary. So it's just to cater for that. So mode 4, natural persons that are suppliers moving abroad to supply the service. So there's an annex in the GATS that clarifies that this does not cover people that want to immigrate, you know. It doesn't prevent governments from imposing visas. It does not, you know, relate to permanent residence or anything like that. Does not allow you to go abroad to look for a job, no, or to enter the labor market abroad, no. It's essentially to cover situations where a supplier wants to fulfill a service contract and then a natural person goes to provide the service. Okay? So, yeah.
So where does the seasonal workers program come from?
I don't think it's covered by that because it's a bit of a different situation. I think in Pay Surplus it's covered because you have, you know, in Pay Surplus these things were addressed a bit separately. But I think in trade agreements, Mode 4 does not cover all movement of people. It covers only people that go abroad to provide a service. These people, the workers program, seasonal workers, they go abroad to work for Australian companies, or they're not really working in the service sector, most of them. No? In some cases, yes. But they're not going as a service supplier. Mode 4 does not cover situations where you have people going abroad to work for some local companies.
but the remittance that each country are receiving is captured under BOP.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the balance of payment statistics do not reflect exactly the modes of supply. It will cover some parts of mode 4 will be covered by balance of payments. Balance of payments may cover a bit more than mode 4, a bit less. So remittances are something I think different than balance of payments. It's covered elsewhere. It's not part of commercial services exports.
So,
Yep.
and then other questions in terms of the IPs, the intellectual property services, what does that comes under these the 4 modes here? Like selling brands and all this?
Well, again, you have to look at it in terms of the modes of supply. So if the supplier is in one country, it's selling something to somebody in another country, they're in different countries, it's typically mode 1. Mode 2, the consumer of the service goes to the country of the supplier. Mode 3, it's by the supplier establishing a commercial presence. And mode 4, it's if the supplier, as a natural person, goes abroad. So it depends how it is supplied by who in which territory. So again, here you have an illustration. In this case, the natural person travels abroad to provide the service.
I'm just a little bit confused with your response to the question that we related to about how Mode 4 don't fit in, or labour mobility under PESA Plus does.
I'm not saying labor mobility is not covered. I'm saying in the GATS, the definition of Mode 4 relates really to trade and services. It's not about labor mobility more generally, which in some trade agreements, they have gone beyond Mode 4 to cover types of labor movement. And of course, seasonal worker program and labor mobility more generally is addressed in PESA Plus in other ways. But in Mode 4, in the GATS, it does not cover a situation where, well, it only covers services, first of all, so it does not cover, in principle, other sectors. So it covers services, and it doesn't cover situations where some people go work for local companies in other countries. So it's a service supplier in their country that goes abroad. Okay, so that supplies a service abroad through a natural person. So it means a legal service company, which is a service supplier, they get a contract to supply the service abroad, and they send a natural person, a lawyer, to physically be there to provide the service. Or the service supplier is an independent lawyer, they goes abroad to provide the service. Temporarily. So Mode 4 is also defined in the GATS as the temporary movement of natural persons to provide the service. It doesn't say what temporary is, but we know that it is temporary. And it excludes, you will see there is an annex in the GATS that excludes certain things. It clarifies that it does not concern people who want to emigrate, people that want to access the labor market abroad, so basically to go work for local firms. Because if you go work for a local firm, you're an employee of a local firm, you're not a service supplier. Okay? So this is not to say that like, I know how labor mobility is important, but it is not part of this. Mode 4 covers only a small aspect of that. And a lot of trade agreements, regional trade agreements, that, and we'll have other chapters that will deal with labor mobility and other aspects like PESA Plus has. But as part of Mode 4, the GATS, it only covers one, but can be an important one, but a small part of what is the movement of natural persons. Temporary movement of natural persons that are service suppliers to provide the service. But there's a lot more movement of people, labor mobility is much broader than that. But what is covered under Mode 4 is only these types of situations.
I think the definition itself, how you explain it here, it actually defines what the labor mobility is. The point is, it's not captured under the GATS. We can all agree to that, right?
This is how it's defined in the GATS.
I know, but the way you explain it, a seasonal work program person goes to Australia, for instance, on a temporary basis. It's a service provider from one country just to go and work for a local company, providing a temporary service abroad.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's a bit complex because you have to look at the different definition. You have to look at how a service supplier is defined. You have to go through all these things. But, I mean, we can go into it in more detail, but I'm telling you, this would not, I mean, I don't think anybody would consider that Mode 4. Because it's not, there's no service supplier in that particular case. Because you cannot be a service supplier as it is defined in the GATS if you are working for a foreign local company. Who's the service supplier? You know, and in any event, it is not, well, it is mostly in the agricultural sector, most of them. But I don't think most members would consider that Mode 4, even though there is labor mobility, but not of the type that is captured under Mode 4. It doesn't mean it's not good or it's not something more important. It probably is, but it's just not something that, and you know, these labor mobility programs, and like the seasonal worker program, is not something that was negotiated as part of, you know, GATS commitments or GATS type commitments in PACER Plus. It was negotiated and discussed in another context, in a broader context of labor mobility, because these definitions do not capture what is labor mobility in the context of a seasonal worker program.
So a construction company, say for example in Australia, construction companies gives a contract to someone in Vanuatu to go over to provide a service. Is that covered under Mode 4 or not?
If it's, depends if it's a contract,
Yes.
it could be covered. I don't think there's a lot of that for construction. It depends, yeah, I mean, it depends what the contract is. I mean, I'm not saying that none of these cases could be covered, but it depends what is the legal status and how it is defined. If it's a contract, you know, for the provision of a service, the contract is with an enterprise in Vanuatu that provides construction services, and that service supplier in Vanuatu, the construction companies, sends somebody, not as an employee of the supplier in Australia, but as it could be.
As a contractor, for example.
If the construction person is an independent professional, yeah. But that's not typically how you would address these things in schedules of the GATS. You won't see that in the schedules of WTO members in most cases. So it does not capture well, you know, the seasonal worker program. And it has to be for the provision of a service. Yeah.
Adding on to our colleague, I think you're just confusing. If it's Mode 4, I understand it's Mode 4 if the contracting party is bringing in all its workers to Vanuatu. Is that correct?
Sorry,
so
say that.
Vanuatu procures from the contracting company in Australia, and if they bring in all their workers into Vanuatu to do the work, then that will be Mode 4.
Who is the supplier of the service?
The scenario was given, it's an Australian company
Yeah.
that's providing the service in Vanuatu. And if they bring in all their workers into Vanuatu, then that will be Mode 4. Is that correct?
It could be.
Well, it is.
Yeah, I mean it's a very simple example. So if
But this is to like not to confuse the state.
yeah, but I mean in the case of a seasonal worker program, the way I understand it, I mean, take the case of construction. Okay? You have a company in Australia that gets a contract to provide a service in Vanuatu, a construction service. And then they decide to send, a few workers to provide that service. If this is covered by the commitment, because we're just talking about the scope, if it's covered, then it could be mode 4. Yeah. If it's temporary and so on, then it could be mode 4. In the case of a seasonal worker program, well, you have to say what is the service, who is the service supplier. It depends on the legal status. Construction workers being sent to Vanuatu are not employed by a local firm in Vanuatu. There is a supplier of the service in Australia that is providing construction services. Most of the commitments, typically of WTO members, would not necessarily cover that situation because they're typically for different categories of persons, but that is something else. What I'm saying is that you need to fit with the definition of mode 4, you need to meet certain criteria. You can imagine cases where it might cover things that resemble seasonal worker program, but it's not something that is made to cover that. Because typically seasonal worker program, you don't have a service supplier of, agricultural services or whatever that is a supplier based in Australia or in this case based in Vanuatu, that would provide these services to somebody in Australia. These are people that go to Australia and that are employed by a local company in Australia. So it's a different situation. And employed by a non-service company also. So you could try to fit it in, but it's not really made for that, and that's why in many trade agreements they have, including PACER Plus, they have tried to deal with these types of worker programs, more general efforts at labor mobility. They have tried to deal with that separately because they want to have something on labor mobility that goes beyond services, that goes beyond mode 4, and that is more ambitious, and that relates to people going to work, in Australia, in hotels, in farms, and not as services suppliers, but as workers. So that goes beyond mode 4. Is it more confused, or it's a bit clear?
So the example that our colleague was talking about was basically mode 4, which is what I elaborated. We understand that labor mobility is covered separately because we are providing a service, but the essence is we go overseas and look for jobs to provide that service. So we understand that, but it's just clarifying that mode 4 is when natural persons come in. So that's what I guess the example that was given.
But you have to be careful because I don't think it would mode 4. The important point to remember here is that it does not cover people that go abroad, to be employed by local companies.
If you think about it,
They have to be service suppliers before they go abroad.
if you think about it, for example, when you send a worker out to pick apples, it's not you produce an apple. You don't produce a service of the worker. So the final product is an apple. And an apple can be sold on the local market or can be exported. But you will see the export of an apple, not the export of a service, because that work will contribute to the production process of the apple. So it wouldn't be an export of a service.
It's even more confusing.
Okay, let's stop it there. I think we'll see it because we're talking in very abstract terms. We're talking in very abstract terms, on the basis of definition of suppliers, and then we'll discuss it further when we see the actual schedule. And then we can also look at your own schedule. And even though I don't think mode 4 would cover, really situations targeted really by labor mobility, generally speaking, because these people are sent abroad to work as employees of some, agricultural companies and hotels and so on. So it doesn't really cater for that. Still, there are things where Mode 4 can be important. There are different services sectors where, people can be hired or can provide services and temporarily go abroad to provide some services. That's a service supplier. Okay? Yeah.
Martin, just the latest thing that the lady was talking about, like you were talking about the remittance in sandstone, that comes under income, not under services. In regards to
Okay, just to conclude, you tell me which, next time I do this, I'll add a question on seasonal workers. Which mode of supply is that? A foreign tourist takes a guided tour of the inland.
Consumption abroad?
Say it loudly, so if I hear one mode, then I know we can move on.
Mode 2.
Mode 2, consumption abroad. The tourist goes abroad to consume guided tour services. A non-resident bank provides financial advice to a client.
Mode 1.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of information here, but it can be mode 1. So the bank that is not established in the territory provides advice to a client abroad, we assume, right? A Russian trucking company transports freight from Russia to Astana, which is in Kazakhstan.
Consumption.
3, 2, 1, 5, 6, no. A Russian trucking company transports cargo from Russia to Kazakhstan. We discussed the example of air transport. Different modes of transport is mode 1. So the transport service is from the territory of one country to territory of the other. You transport, in this case, cargo from one country to the other. Mode 1. So that's mode 1 is relevant for road transport, rail transport, air transport, even though it's not covered, maritime transport, mode 1.
They're not moving, they're just staying in their place and they're providing a service. But here the service is being provided across supply. You stay in your own country, but you're providing a service that's not physical.
Yeah, but in this case it is a bit physical because you have a company, the supplier, the trucking company is Russian, it is established in Russia, it provides a service, it transports cargo, that is the service that crosses the border, right? Of course you also need the truck to typically to cross the border, but it is the service that crosses the border. So that is mode 1 for maritime transport, road transport, services provided from the territory of one member to the territory of the other. A foreign lawyer, pursuant to a service contract, comes into the country to advise a client. No, it's seasonal worker. No. Yes, mode 4. Very good. Okay? I think I'll...
So these modes excludes embassy, foreign embassy modes.
Yes.
Because it's all under government.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be really a different territory. So it's territory of one member to territory of another member. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. How would you treat a service provider like Starlink?
Like what?
Starlink.
Starlink that provide internet multi-country in the world.
Sorry.
Starlink? The
Satellite.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be mode 1, I would think. It's a way to provide, I mean, it can be, it's just a technology that is used to provide service from one territory to the other. I mean, you also have, yeah, I won't complicate it more.
I'll make it more complicated.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to this a bit later, but I think I'll leave it to Richard to continue, and then later on we can come back to some of the key obligations in the GATS that you will also find in PACER Plus, like MFN, Most Favored Nation treatment, national treatment, market access. So we'll come back and discuss these obligations in more detail, because now we've only seen the scope, and the scope can be very broad, you know, including, and sometimes it's not, you know, 100% clear, because you see the definitions of the modes, it stands in one sentence, right? And sometimes you have some additional annexes to clarify, but the scope generally is broad. But in itself, that does not necessarily mean a whole lot, because it depends what are the obligations. And we'll see later that the obligations are a lot more narrow. So the scope is big, you know, what are the modes of supply? It's very big, but in the end, what matters are the specific obligations that will apply to these different modes of supply, and then the commitments that countries undertake for each of the modes of supply. Okay, and that we'll come back to a bit later. No more comments? Yeah?
See, these modes apply to member countries of WTO. What happens if the receiving country is not a member of these GATT agreements?
Well, I mean, the obligations of the WTO only apply to WTO members. So that covers, what, more than 160 members now. It doesn't mean that you don't allow other, you know, suppliers from FSM or Kiribati or those countries that are not WTO members. But those that benefit from the guarantees that are supplied, the legal guarantees, are the WTO members. So Cook Islands does not benefit from the guarantee. It doesn't mean that others will not accept or allow the services from Cook Islands or Kiribati to be supplied. It means that there's no legal guarantee. So if they want, they don't have to allow these foreign suppliers and foreign services from those countries. But in practice, I think they would allow it, but there's just no guarantee. Okay? Yeah.
There's some interesting on the revenue for each mode. Do you have a stats on which mode supply the most revenue for the country at the national level, or you don't have that?
Well, we don't. It's not. Yeah. Well, it's not like for goods. You have the customs duty. So we don't have customs duties for services normally. So it's not the same thing. So you can restrict mode 1. You can restrict different modes of supply, but these restrictions doesn't mean you get revenue. You don't impose a tariff. So, of course, if somebody comes into your territory, you can tax the foreign tourists coming in, so you can get revenue from that. If a foreign investment comes in, he's established in your territory, you can tax his revenues like you tax any other local company. But it's not a customs duty. It's an income tax. Yeah. Okay?